Hello everyone, welcome to Rosalia TV, El Mundo de Pilar Aymara. Today the Women's Conference of the Alba Party took place, a very powerful event, I have to say. And with me to comment on this event is Eva Comrie. She is the Alba candidate for Mid Scotland and Fife. Hello, Eva.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm fine, I'm fine. I'm very impressed, I have to say, because from Rosalia TV, we've been reporting on women's events in Brussels, in Galicia, etc. And I have to say that the energy is always very, very powerful. So I was very impressed with some interventions, some speeches, okay? But I want to ask you, from your point of view, what do you achieve with this event? Tell us about the Women's Conference.
As you say, it was very powerful and energising. I'm still recovering from the amount of enthusiasm and energy that there was there. I'm really quite taken aback that it was so strong and so very, very positive. It was also very emotional, because many of the women who were observing, watching and sending in questions made it very painfully plain to us that they've suffered a great deal over the course of the past few years when they've worried about women and girls' rights being undermined or eroded. Mm-hmm. And that's a great sadness for us all, because we in Alba believe that in this modern world, everybody's human rights should be respected and promoted, but not at the cost of anybody else's. And I think that's been the ongoing, very difficult, very heated debate in Scotland, certainly in the last few years. So what we learned today from our participants and from our audience very much gave us the line that we were very much on the right side in trying to promote women's rights, but again, not at the expense of others. Where we're confident that we're doing the right thing is we heard from a number of women who felt that they had been silenced, that their concerns had been swept aside, and that whenever they tried to speak honestly or openly or to question developing policies, particularly in relation to self-identification, in relation to gender issues, they were being accused quite wrongly of transphobia, of bigotry, and of quite despicable behaviour, none of which they were guilty of. And that's a trouble for me. I'm 58 years old, Pilar. I'm a lawyer. I've been working in the law for almost 40 years. And my first jobs were representing women and women's interests and trying to secure and protect women who were the victims of all sorts of violence and abuse. So to find that political parties in Scotland were being abusive towards women and condoning abuse towards women was really most distressing experience for me, and it's not one that I'm willing to repeat, and I'm not going to stand by and watch it happen to other women. So what we learned today confirms that our policy on protecting women's safe spaces is the right one. It's the favoured approach, it's what women need, and it's what women desperately want. They don't want to be invaded by people who after a few months can self-ID. What was particularly interesting for me, given my interest in the law, was to hear from Rona Hotchkiss of her views and her experience both within the health sector and particularly in relation to the women's prisons estate. And she spoke most eloquently and very emotionally about issues to do with trans identifying males who describe themselves as trans women seeking to be accommodated within the women's prison estate, and the impact, the terrible impact that that has on female prisoners. I think you'll know, Pilar, that much research worldwide has shown that many female offenders who are in prison are the most vulnerable within our society, who've suffered dreadful abuse often. Some of them were children who had been abused. They've grown up into having adult abusive relationships. some have struggled with addictions, and when they find themselves in prison, absolutely the last thing that they need is to be confronted with unexpectedly a male body who may behave very badly and say nasty things, all of which can be triggers in relation to earlier episodes of abuse and trauma. So I really think that Rona Hotchkiss's contribution to this debate should never be undervalued, and certainly she's a very respected voice, sometimes almost a lone voice in these very difficult and challenging times.
Did I understand well that the Scottish government is already breaking the international law? Is that true, or?
That's certainly Rona's take on it, because what she pointed out was that the international conventions say that men and women ought not to be housed in the same prison. But clearly there are male bodies who identify as trans who want to be in women's prisons. And that seems at the moment to be something that the Scottish Government has not prohibited. And that seems to me to be quite wrong.
Well, there was a lot of information and very shocking information from my point of view, because here in Spain, for example, there was an attempt to approve a trans law. It was a proposal from Podemos, but the lack of consensus, or the lack of agreement, provoked the withdrawal of the law, because it was, I don't know, I think that it must be a very respectful, democratic debate. And I have to say, and in deep, it should be in deep, a debate in deep. And I have to say that I've been speaking to women in Scotland, and most of them share with me concerns about the lack of communication. I think it's a global issue, that trying to cut and have the freedom of speech. And they were telling me, they were sharing with me their concerns about that lack of communication, that lack of debate, the abuse online, the toxic debate existent in social network that I have to say I've seen during this along 2-3 years, no? And she shared with they share with me the feeling that some laws are being approved in the back door. That's true. That's the feeling.
That's right. The feeling is that there is legislation that's been introduced by stealth, and it's deceitful, because really the public at large don't know what's going on behind closed doors. A good example of that is that the Scottish Government had a policy whereby on public boards there should be 50-50 gender representation. However, the definition of woman now includes trans women. So in effect, what's perfectly possible as the result of a recent court decision is that in future public boards could be comprised of 50% men and 50% trans women who remain physically men, if self-ID continues along the lines currently proposed by the Scottish Government. Now, the public don't know that. It's not well publicised, despite the best efforts of organisations such as forwomen.scot, who took the recent case to court. I think most people think that the gender debate is to do with fairly trivial aspects in some respects, and the ridicule that's usually thrown up is to do with gender neutral toilets. But that's only one small aspect of a much wider debate. What self-ID would do, if it was promoted and passed in the form currently favoured by the Scottish Government, is it would enable somebody to self-identify as, say, a woman with a male body, and then gain access to all women's safe spaces. So that is not restricted to the use of such a thing as a gender neutral toilet. It means use of all women's spaces, including hospital wards, prisons, it would enable a trans woman who still has a man's body to say that she, as he would become a she, is authorised, for example, to conduct examinations of women who might have been assaulted, might be the victims of indecency. It would enable across the board the complete erosion of all the rights of women that have been fought for over so many decades, fought for hard and hard won, completely written out practically overnight without proper consultation. Now, the Scottish Government will say they have consulted, and they have had an online consultation, but half of the responses there came from out with Scotland. And I think most of the public didn't know the consultation process was ongoing. But to add insult to injury, the Scottish Government minister who was in charge of the process of re-consulting, which was a promise made, spoke at a conference a while ago where she still insisted that trans women are women. And the difficulty about that, of course, is the whole self-ID issue. This isn't about hatred of trans, it's not about transphobia, it's about the definition and the practice of self-ID and the concomitant oppression of women's rights that self-identification in its form as proposed by the Scottish Government will bring.
Mm-hmm. Eva, many people are leaving the Scottish National Party and joining the Alba Party. I've noticed many of them send me messages explaining why. Was your case that?
Yeah. What happened with me was that I had applied to be an SNP candidate, and they promoted me to the top, the #1 position on their regional list for Mid-Scotland and Fife. But that was on the basis of their policy in relation to the promotion of the disabled. So I was #1 because I was disabled. That didn't sit right with me. My disability is a physical one insofar as I'm an amputee, and I have various other physical difficulties. But I didn't feel that the fact that I was disabled by itself justified that position. In addition, there were other things going on, including the gender debate, which attracted me to the Alba Party. But the greatest reason for my move was because I know with a deal of confidence that I would never have been elected to the SNP off the regional list for Mid-Scotland and Fife, because the more constituency seats that a party gains, the less seats a party is likely to gain on the list. So in my region, last time round, the SNP got no list seats because they swept the boards on the constituency seats. So my chances of being elected could only come from the list, but could only come from a party which does not have candidates likely to succeed on the constituencies. So what Alex Salmond wants to do, and I absolutely wholeheartedly support him in this obviously, is to promote the notion of the supermajority, whereby instead of simply having a position with the SNP winning all the constituency seats, Alba can pick up list votes and list seats and enhance that majority by hopefully having a 2/3 majority of MSPs who are independence supporting, where independence for Scotland is the principal aim and the principal purpose of the party. That can't be said for anybody other than the SNP and Alba.
Eva, there's a lot of pictures all over the media, the news, the mainstream media, no, but the social network, Twitter, Facebook, etc., with the colors of the suffragettes. And I was very impressed with the weaving of the I say wise woman, no, the older woman, because I love historical memory, no. And do you think it's necessary to remember to have a look at the past, to support and protect and defend all what the suffragettes fought for? Yeah,
we must learn from the past, Pilar. If we don't learn from the past, we're going nowhere fast. My two grandmothers were born in 1901, and of course they did not have the vote. when they eventually were able to vote, they cherished that. It took a long time to get it, but I'm sure I'm not flinging away any of the rights that they and their generation fought for. My grannies, one of them worked on farms when her husband was away in the army in the Second World War, and she had to work on the farm to be able to keep the tied house that her family and her children lived in. My other granny was in a tied house, and when her husband died, she and her young children, including my late father, were evicted and had to go and find a home elsewhere. These are things that ought not to happen. But these events occurred principally because women didn't count. And we can't have that. Mm-hmm. And if we allow the erosion of women's rights that seems to be on the agenda just now to continue, all that we will do is turn the clock back to those days when women were expected to wheesht. And women in Scotland are not going to wheesht anymore. Today proved that absolutely by a million miles. The women who were participating in that conference today had found a safe space where they could express opinions, and they could do so in the knowledge that they were in supportive company, where they could ask sensible questions about things very dear to their own hearts. I'd one question in particular from a woman that was almost heartbreaking. She asked if her daughter, who has a disability, was likely to lose her right to have a same-sex medic. And the lady was right enough. It was a very apposite question to be asking. And it's dreadful that a mother in that set of circumstances is so distraught about this, that she's got to ask the question in a private forum, because she knows if she asked it out loud in public, she would have, you know, the wrath of others rain down upon her. We can't have this. We owe it to all of these women, including the suffragettes who paved the way for folk like me to be able to speak up and to get to university and to get an education and to break into a male profession. We owe it to all of them to do our best and to keep on being heard.
Eva, if you get elected, what kind of actions you will take in the Scottish Parliament and for the Alba Party and to protect women's rights?
Right, well, certainly in the Alba Party, what we've done is we have a draft policy we've worked on, and will be taken into account, obviously, the views and the opinions expressed today. That will be launched, I hope, on Monday. And what we intend to do is to safeguard and promote women's safe spaces and all of women's rights, including the right to talk and to have freedom of speech without being accused of phobias or hate crimes. These are the things we need to promote, but overall, we want to promote the supermajority heading towards Scottish independence sooner rather than later, because that freedom, such a precious, precious entity for a country, is also the gift that we want everybody in Scotland to enjoy, and that includes women who should be able to go about their lives freely, not feel oppressed, not feel that there are things they cannot say, and not feel that there are places that they can no longer go. So, in essence, what I'm about and Alba is about is freedom for the country and freedom for all the people of the country.
Eva Comrie, I have a lot of questions more, but I know you're very busy, and I thank you for your time. I thank you for all these explanations, because it's very useful for me, and I'm sure that it's going to be very useful for women listening to this interview. And of course, I'll be keeping an eye on your next events, because I have to say that it was impressive today, and I think it's very necessary. I think there is a global problem for women. We're facing a lot of challenges, threats against the freedom of speech, and of course, we'll be there to fight for our freedom of speech and for women's rights. So thank you very much, Eva. Best of luck to you and all the women.
Muchas gracias.
Oh, bueno, estupendo. Muchas gracias.